Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 38 review and also my 22-23 season review. I got very lucky at the very end. I got carried by Harry Kane effectively towards the top 10k. The first time this season I actually got into the 4 digits territory, and I'm so happy that happened. I was at FPL meets as well, so that was a lovely event to be at, sort of watch the final games too. And ultimately, I'm very happy with how the season turned out. But I still think that the review is here and it's important because I can reflect back at some of my weaknesses this season as a manager and probably look at what kind of mistakes that I've made that are probably things that I could avoid next season. And looking back at my season, I already know quite clearly 2 game weeks where I suffered quite a bit, but whether it's actually non-repeatable is a separate question. I think game week 36, of course, was devastating for me, but at the same time, game week 13, in my opinion, was actually the rank that hurt me the most because I think I actually played extremely poorly that week, and I took way too many risks in that week trying to sort of jump ahead of the curve a little bit too early. And ultimately, I think FPL is actually a marathon, not a sprint. I think people say that, and it's true because if you have a very solid, consistent team and they're consistently giving you points, there's no reason to dramatically change the structure of your team. And that's something that I learned in Game Week 13 when I was trying to jump ahead of the curve effectively. But if we look at Game Week 38, let's just quickly review that first. I was effectively carried by Harry Kane, of course, who did tremendously for me. The Kane captaincy was something that I think is going to be a huge talking point as well when we look back at captaincy. And ultimately, sometimes captaincy is always a 50-50 decision. I was very close to getting Rashford because Rashford was the only player that was confirmed to start. And so actually, I had my captaincy on Rashford when I loaded up my deadline stream. And then I moved it to Salah. And then I moved it to Kane. But why did I ultimately land on Kane? The reason why for me was simply because I knew Kane was probably going to play 90 minutes of football. I couldn't say the same for Salah, and I definitely couldn't say the same for Rashford. When it comes to the home and away fixtures, clearly it was beneficial to Rashford, who had a much easier home fixture, and we know Old Trafford are an absolute force at home. Whereas with Liverpool and even Spurs, I would say Spurs have actually been quite stop-start both at home and away, so I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. But also when you look at Liverpool, of course, Salah is someone who has been much more efficient when it comes to his performances at Anfield and overall the team as well. As far as Salah, he actually had very, very good expected goal involvement. So when we look back with hindsight, actually Salah and Kane captaincy should have been much closer. But I was very lucky, of course, to be on the side of the Kane captaincy. And sometimes that's what FPL is. It's just a game of luck in that sort of aspect. The reason why I actually went with Kane, though, is because I thought about the game state of the Salah game. Ultimately, Liverpool didn't have anything to play for. Spurs technically did, right? Spurs were the team that could have potentially fought for a Europa Conference League spot if, for whatever reason, Brighton were able to, let's say, take points away from Aston Villa. Not only that, but Salah was also within a Liverpool team that actually had a few testimonials effectively to give away. James Milner, Oxlade-Chamberlain potentially, even Keita, who actually I think ended up not even being fit for the game, which is of course testament to his time at Liverpool. But that for me also took away from minutes from Salah, but also the element of penalties. So every week you have to sort of think about how important it is to actually have a penalty taker as your captain, because you could get a huge set of points that you would never really expect usually if, let's say, you were continuously captaining someone like Rashford, who has to give away penalties to Bruno. Now, as things stand, Bruno actually pretty much only got 1 penalty this season, and he took it in the week previous. But Rashford, of course, he is someone who doesn't get penalties, and therefore sometimes that's going to have to take away from your captaincy consideration. And for this week, with James Milner being on the pitch, I actually thought that there was a high chance that Salah might have lost penalties as well. And that's kind of how I saw things, and that's why I ended up going with Kane. And as I said, very, very lucky. But what about my worst game weeks of the season? I think my absolute worst game week of the season was game week 13. And you can see here that Darwin's on my bench. I effectively took a -4, and my game week rank was absolutely abominable. I had a 9 million game week rank, and that's actually not even counting my hits. So it was a very, very, very tragic week. I actually had Kane in the structure. So I had a 3-medium structure at this point in time. I had Kane, Salah, Haaland. And I decided to drop out of Kane because I really wanted to get 2 shiny new toys. And that was Foden and that was Darwin. At this point in time, Foden had multiple great hauls. I think he had 12 points the week prior. But this is where actually, funnily enough, Grealish ended up sort of usurping Foden as the starting left wing at this point in the season. And Darwin, the biggest mistake on my part was actually not waiting for the press conference with Jurgen Klopp and actually being a little bit too greedy as well. I went for Darwin when he actually had a potential knock versus Nottingham Forest, so he wasn't even really ready to play. And I was just really excited with Darwin's play. And I think the learning point here is not necessarily, of course, how I could have done better in terms of points, but what it means to actually have very consistent players in FPL and what it means to not jump ahead of the curve and actually grab that shiny new toy by breaking apart your team structure. Because if you actually have a look at my YouTube video for Game Week 13, I actually had two options. One, this very, very aggressive option to go towards Darwin and Foden, because I really wanted to chase rank and really continue to build on my 30 to 40k rank at this point in time, versus simply just keeping Kane and actually going for an Arsenal defender. And actually my transfer option was going to be just a single free transfer towards Ben White, who, if you actually look at the fixtures after this, ended up getting 6 to 7 points every single week. So that was actually another transfer that I really missed out on a lot of points on weeks after this. So this Game Week 13 really struggled, or was a struggle for me after this point in time. You can also see that I also went very early into triple Newcastle defense, but didn't manage to capture any of the big clean sheet run that they had post World Cup. So that was, of course, a little bit of a fail, but I think we did, of course, spot that Newcastle was a good defense. And sometimes clean sheets is what it comes down to, just purely luck, where you might be performing better in specific games. You might not have conceded many chances, but you're still going to concede like an Ederson does. And then obviously in a game like versus Everton, Ederson magically gets a clean sheet despite conceding the most amount of opportunities he's actually faced in any fixture this season. So that's kind of what it comes down to. But I do think that the big mistake here was really jumping away from someone like Kane, who has been consistent. Sometimes you have to look back. How many seasons has this player been consistent? Someone like Salah, someone like Kane. These two players have been a paragon of consistency in FPL, and moving away from them, you should be cautious to do that in FPL to grab that shiny new toy in Darwin. Someone who at the time was still potentially fighting for his first place spot in the team with Firmino. And as it turns out, of course, later in the season, he was still continuing to fight for that spot when Jota recovered from injury. So this was potentially my worst game week of the season, just in terms of my independent play. And then, of course, we have the game week in Game Week 36, where Wilson completely murdered me effectively. And I have to say, this isn't something that I really foresaw, right? Wilson was absolutely a great option. He was someone that I had as a top option in the cheat sheet, but I didn't expect Wilson, of course, to score something like a 34-point difference versus Isaac. And as it turns out, of course, he did. And, you know, potentially we have to just look at how wrong we were with the minutes expectations with Wilson. But I also think when it comes down to it, Wilson getting 3 goals and 1 assist versus Isaac's 1 penalty assist is something that we didn't expect. And a good example of that is just looking at that Chelsea game at the final game week of the season, Game Week 38. Wilson's on the bench and ultimately doesn't get many opportunities. And we expected something like that in the double game week, where because there was a tight schedule, because Wilson is someone who's historically not fit enough to play in these double game weeks, we expected potentially an Isaac start at least one of those games in that central forward position, but it wasn't the case. Wilson actually ended up getting 2 starts, getting very, very good minutes, and Isaac actually got subbed off earlier than him in the Brighton fixture when Wilson actually ended up hauling at the very last 5 minutes of the game. And those are kind of things that FPL comes down to. I don't think I really could have avoided it. The reason why I couldn't is because I took a punt towards Foden the week prior, and ultimately the punt didn't work out because on Game Week 35, I wasn't able to get many points from Foden. Instead, Mahrez and Gundogan owners did extremely well, and I missed out on the transfer opportunity to get 2 free transfers by rolling on Game Week 35 to actually go for something like Botman out and then Wilson in. And yeah, that's what it comes down to in FPL. I think this is a game week where it was rather unavoidable for me. And I would always make that Foden punt because it made a lot of sense in Game Week 35, as I didn't have any, lovely transfer options. And we knew that Grealish was benched as well. So that's something I think in hindsight, I couldn't have done anything about, looking back at my decision making that week. Another terrible week that I had was on Game Week 19. This is actually just a week where Kane got 16 points. And potentially, I think the story, of course, is why not keep Kane once again, right? Someone who's super consistent, as opposed to going for someone like De Bruyne or Salah. I actually went for De Bruyne, and I think Salah was actually someone who on Game Week 17 or 18 scored 12 points. So I already missed out on that and effectively went for the third premium option, which was De Bruyne instead. I don't have too many regrets about this. Of course, Kane can haul in any fixture. Crystal Palace as well, I think, is where he scored 16 points. But for me, De Bruyne actually entered a serious run of poor form. And potentially, we could say that we called it, because watching the World Cup, De Bruyne actually had some pretty terrible matches. And I think he brought that sort of poor level of form into a few run of games in the Premier League before he started to do well again, which was basically the next time he played versus Arsenal, when he actually had that lovely goal with the Tomiyasu mistake. But that's kind of how things fall. And ultimately, I think De Bruyne was someone I went for because I like backing double game week fixtures and players who actually have that. So I don't have crazy regrets about that, and ultimately that's just how the way things fall. As far as Game Week 32, this is actually one of the highlights of my season. So I'm actually looking now at my highlights, and the highlight really was just getting Isaac in my team, also getting Tony in my team. I think a lot of people were getting caught up with Solanke, who actually hit the post. So he was quite unfortunate to not haul, but also going for Jesus as well at all costs. And when I look back at this and I actually think back to my Game Week 32 free hit videos, I actually had two variations. One where I had Robertson and Odegaard, and one where at the end, which I went with, which was Gabriel and Gakpo. We know actually Gakpo actually ended up scoring the next week, and I think the week after. But you can't always call this. I think sometimes FPL, it is a bit of a game of luck where you can't necessarily nail on when Odegaard is going to score, when Robertson's going to get an assist. Gabriel had plenty of opportunities to get a header in that Southampton game. Jesus as well was someone that I definitely probably, in hindsight actually missed out on, because he had so many great opportunities, and I think his poor clinical finishing let him down. But that's actually what let me get such a lucky game week, because I managed to get Isaac in my team, and he actually totally carried me in this week. And things like that do happen. Your 50-50 calls are not going to go your way, and sometimes you have to look back and say, did the 50 call make sense? And if it did, that's fine. Sometimes you're going to get things wrong. And in this occasion, I got Gabriel and Robertson wrong, and Gakpo and Odegaard wrong as well. But ultimately, it was still one of my best weeks of the season, so I have no regrets there. Moving back to my sort of general trajectory within the rise for my ranks this season, I think it was worth actually looking at Game Week 26 and how important that was in terms of my chip strategy, right? Because I decided to effectively put the wild card on Game Week 26, so I therefore missed the mega haul for Liverpool versus United. But of course, I also avoided the Salah penalty versus Bournemouth, which was the immediate aftermath of that. And as you can see, the general chip strategy worked out really well. Game Week 29 was one of the best weeks of my season. It gave me a huge rank boost, got me out of the top 117k territory, got me to 67k, and that's where I started to build some very, very consistent green arrows. I think I was actually a little bit unfortunate because I was a Shaw owner, so if we actually look at Game Week 29, despite it being such a good game week for me on paper, having Steele, for example, who was electric, having a really solid bench boost here as well with Kane, Botman, and Kepa. I think I was a bit unfortunate compared to, let's say, the De Gea owners, because if you remember, a couple of weeks after this anyways, players like Shaw completely missed out on clean sheets, right? So United got the Everton clean sheet. Shaw also missed out the clean sheet versus Nottingham Forest. And I also actually, to be honest, if you just look back at Game Week 29, missed out on the clean sheet here versus Brentford. So that was very, very unfortunate for me. But overall, the transfer strategy to go towards a wildcard in 26 made a lot of sense, because when we actually saw the way the FA Cup fixtures unfolded with the very significant Tottenham and Leicester losses, we knew that the structure of our teams in Game Week 29 was actually very similar to what our teams would look like in Game Week 34. So if you look here, I've got Fernandes, and I ended up dropping Fernandes, but effectively the structure of this team here, with Haaland coming back the week after, is very, very similar to what our teams ended up looking like in Game Week 34. So the general idea and the strategy element of the chip strategy was actually very good in my opinion, because our teams end up being very homogenous in Game Week 29 and 34. And looking back, that's something to think about too in the future. Chip strategy usually is something where people plan to actually save the chips towards the end of the season. This was a unique opportunity because of the way things unfolded, obviously with, the Monarchs' death early in the season, and then also the way the FA Cup fixtures unfolded with effectively, a less than 1% chance where Tottenham lost and Leicester lost, which created these huge amount of doubles this season that we didn't necessarily expect. But we could anticipate in the future that Newcastle would have some great fixtures, that United would have some great fixtures, that Brighton would have some great fixtures. And that's actually why I was so confident in going for that wild card. And I think it did pay off looking into the future and planning ahead from that point of view. And I think that's why you can see when I look at my game week history, just in general, how effective it was, because it was effectively that Game Week 26 point in the season where I consistently built a lot of green arrows and just consistently rose back to Game Week 38. Obviously, a lot of lucky captaincies here, potentially also a bad week in Game Week 28 when I look back. I think a learning point here with going for the Tony captaincy is, of course, we all know the funny story about Tony and his binary holes where he gets, 0 goals one game and either 1 or 2 goals the next game. But also just looking back, I think I potentially paid too much attention really to Arsenal's results in the Europa League. And also that completely made me miss the Saka captaincy at the same time as well. Kane had a perfectly good game himself, and I completely missed on that. I just wanted to jump on Tony, wanted to be differential. And sometimes the idea of being differential isn't necessarily something that we need to jump on all the time. But Saka had a perfectly good home fixture here, and I totally missed the boat on that because I was very low in Arsenal. And when we look back, for example, at the Wolves game at the end of the season, that's potentially why a lot of people, didn't really jump back into an Arsenal asset like a Saka, like a Jesus, who did extremely well. Because ultimately, this Arsenal team, for the most parts of the season, like 85% of the season, were a fantastic team, particularly on attack and particularly at home. So that's probably one opportunity where I would say, looking back at captaincies, if there was a very, very obvious captaincy option that I totally missed out on and completely neglected because of my own personal bias, this was probably Game Week 28. But overall, as I said, I think most of the season I was actually carried by some fortunate captaincies, some good strategy in Game Week 26, and a lot of it was damage reparation for that really, really bad week in Game Week 13. So that's effectively my season summarized when it comes to the game weeks. But I think now we can actually move on to the strategy around my players and who actually really carried my team over the course of the season when it comes to players for my team. So this is something you can actually access by going to livefpl.net, and you can download your season summary effectively of who are your best players who actually got you the most amount of green arrows, and who are the best or the worst players really who got you the most amount of reds in comparison to, let's say, the top 10Ks. So I thought it would be useful to just quickly look at some of the players, maybe even talk about how I felt about my best players effectively for my team and also my worst, and how I thought about that over the course of the season. I've also tiered it in a sense very much like the cheat sheet. So of course our best 10 players are players like Saka and Trent. And I think, Trent's very fitting because a lot of people have probably criticized me as well for maybe sticking by Liverpool a bit too much this season, particularly during their really poor run of form from the defensive point of view, where even Trent wasn't actually offering much on attack until he had switched into that midfield position. So what I can say, of course, I think, is that I probably underestimated how good of a defense that United were, as opposed to overestimated how good of a defense Liverpool was. At the end of the day, you still want to pick fullbacks that can actually provide something in the attacking sense. I don't think there were many good defensive teams this season, with exception to Arsenal and Newcastle at the early point in the season. And then we saw United actually solidify a lot when they had an easy run of fixtures post-World Cup. And then also, when they had a lot of these doubles with really easy fixtures once again, from Game Week 29 onwards, we saw a lot of clean sheets. And I think at that time, of course, I had already adjusted, mentally to getting United players like a Shaw back into my team. But it's clear potentially that I had a bit of a preference and a bias towards Trent, although it did seem to also work out quite well for me, given that he's such a big contributor to my team. Saka is actually interesting because if you've been following me from last year, I mean, he is my superstar, obviously, for this year, but he was actually someone who probably was my biggest rank killer in the previous year. And I think I have to admit, sometimes in FPL, the best thing to do is to make sure you remove any bias you have towards a certain player. And if, for example, you've been hurt by a certain player, I understand some people have a reluctance, for example, to continue insisting not to go for a certain player. And that was sort of me last year with Saka. Whereas this year, I think I had already admitted to myself that he was a fantastic player and someone that I would absolutely love to go for if Arsenal continued to really develop on attack and show that they were one of the best teams in the league, and they did. So Saka was someone that I really stuck by for most parts of the season that I liked. Salah is interesting here because obviously you can see Kane is up there too, and there's going to be parts of the season where a lot of us had Salah and Haaland or Kane and Haaland, and ultimately you can see I clearly went with Salah and Haaland a little bit more, and some people probably would have actually stuck with Kane a bit more. And I'd be interested to see that Kane is probably one of the people who killed me the most this season. But it's good to know that, of course, I benefited from Kane a lot, and of course Game Week 38 is a huge chunk of that. As far as players like Kepa and Steele, it's interesting to see, of course, how much of a contribution goalkeepers can do. And actually, it seems like, of course, there was a certain section of the majority who actually switched to Kepa as soon as he became a starter. And sometimes I feel like with keepers, whenever you have big changes and a manager really puts a new keeper onto the field, I always feel like that keeper almost feels like they're going to be nailed for a while, because to actually change your keeper is such a drastic decision that unless, for example, let's say Ederson, who actually gets rest from time to time, which is very, very odd, it's not often that managers do keeper changes. And that's why I'm usually always ready to jump onto a keeper change. When I had Sanchez on the wildcard in 26, I was very happy to move into Steele in that situation, and the same with Kepa. McAllister, I think this is just simply, either you went March or McAllister, so I don't think there's really much between it. Of course, I was lucky to get the McAllister penalty at pretty much the dying stages of the game versus United. But Martinelli here being a little bit lower than I would have expected, given that I actually played him a lot this season, probably suggests that I didn't actually keep Martinelli for a lot of his holes, which was when Nketiah started to get benched. As far as De Bruyne, I also kept him for quite a bit this season, so it's a little bit dismaying to see how much he contributed for me, similar to Darwin, but I think there's also stories there where sometimes it's fair to say, of course, that despite De Bruyne being a world-class player, it always makes sense more to go towards players like Salah and Kane, who are going to get you more nailed numbers because they're penalty takers and also simply because they are actually goal scorers, as opposed to people like a Bruno or a De Bruyne who are a bit more creative, and you have to rely on one of those great games where they get multiple assists, get a lot of bonus points to get that sort of haul that you want from them. Whereas with Salah and Kane, a steady amount of 7 to 8 points is actually a huge difference over the course of the season. I probably jumped onto Mitoma a bit late. I think I had jumped on Isaac early and I also got lucky with a free hit. Other picks, I think here, when we look at some of the yellow and orange options, you can clearly see that I missed out on a lot of Shaw points. Potentially missed out on a bit of Fernandes as well. I think Schär was someone that I dropped early on or later in the season, and a lot of people actually picked up on him after the World Cup. So it feels a bit bad to not actually get too many Schär points. But it is sort of the way things are. Cancelo being there is interesting because, of course, he actually left mid-season. So that also tells you the tale of the tape with how bad defenders have been this year and also how strong forwards have been, because someone like Tony, who I didn't even own for most of the season, even, for example, his hat-trick versus Leeds, he's been fantastic all year round, and I probably haven't owned him enough. And that's a lesson learned as well with someone like Mitrovic, who I think early in the season I had also missed out on. And potentially when we look into next year, looking for these sort of mid-table talisman target strikers could be the way to go, particularly if the pricing is very kind to them. Nonto is the only person I'd also shout out here, where he was fantastic for me because he scored in that really random game versus United, even though he blanked versus Nottingham Forest in that double game week. Other than that, let's actually move on to the losers, really, for my team. Or the people who really killed me effectively. Kane, of course, very expected here, but keep in mind, of course, that I also got 47 effective points from Kane. So when it comes down to it, Kane and Salah being here, if you actually add up your Kane and Salah points and look at the total loss versus top 10k versus your total gain over the top 10k, as long as your gain is green, then it probably suggests that you actually played it right when it comes to the swings between owning Kane at the right time and owning Salah at the right time. Clearly, Almiron and Estupiñán, two players who absolutely destroyed me. If you saw Steele as well, was someone actually who got me a lot of points, and Steele still only effectively gave me 18 or 20 odd points, whereas Estupiñán clearly was one of those big fullback assets that I think I clearly missed the boat on, particularly in that wildcard 26, because I opted for Sanchez because I wanted that additional fixture in blank game week 28. But as it turns out, of course, Estupiñán was much more valuable. And that's potentially a lesson learned as well when you have such a strong fullback. And part of that is a misjudgment on myself in terms of minutes, and also potentially not expecting that Sanchez would be benched. Martinelli, of course, as you can see, and even Odegaard, people who did really well versus me. I think it's very normal to actually see a lot of Arsenal players on this list because ultimately Arsenal were a super team. They had very cheap prices. All their players actually were very much contributing towards great hauls. So when you compare it to a team like City that are very dominant, players like Mahrez and Foden didn't really get owned at the right course in time, whereas players like Odegaard and Martinelli were much more steady. Even Saliba and Gabriel with the consistent, and White as well, with very, very consistent clean sheets. Shaw appearing here is very fair because I talked about how I didn't own Shaw post-World Cup. And with players like Wilson, I mean, he effectively, that's potentially just one single game week worth of damage from Wilson over there. And some other players that I'm looking at this list that I'm pretty sad to see is someone like Foden, who I actually owned for a lot of the season. And I feel like I never really captured the correct time to own Foden points. Mahrez as well, who I didn't actually own at all this season, but he was someone that I've always sort of missed out on because I don't really like dipping into that sort of pep roulette aspect of things unless it's Foden, and I wasn't able to get the best out of Foden. Instead, Foden probably actually hurt me a bit more than he was a positive for me, for my team this season, and that is a little bit hard to take. And it's things like looking at Tony as well, showing that I probably could have owned players like Tony and Wilson who are actually very, very well priced. And sometimes it's also about judging the attack and judging when you have a talisman. So Wilson, of course, I think it's tough because he's always injured and there was a stop-start aspect of that, whereas with Tony, he was very consistent all year round, and definitely someone that I missed out. Mitrovic as well, when you actually have a look at this. And De Gea, I think that was a bit more of a element of luck on the part of Shaw, let's say, missing out a lot of games. And actually, I did bench Shaw 12 points when I actually owned him at one point in time. I think he was playing either Newcastle or Arsenal. Can't exactly remember which game it was, but I did bench Shaw at one point for 12 points, and that hurt a lot this season. And that was probably one of my lowlights. But when it comes down to it, I don't think there was too many significant mistakes other than maybe misjudging Estupinian. And sometimes, you know, that you're going to miss one or two boats each season in terms of players who suddenly have a massive, great run of games. Almiron is the perfect example of that. Someone who did incredibly well for around 7 to 8 game weeks in a row, could not stop scoring, but then eventually petered off because he also got injured, and that's a bit unfortunate, of course, for him. He was instrumental in that Brighton game as well. Once again, one of the big contributors for why Wilson did well. And Raya, I think, is also another player I missed, because by going for Sanchez on the wildcard on 26, I kept Kep in my team and actually missed out on Raya, someone who actually got a lot of save points next season. So maybe when we look at next year, and if Raya actually leaves this Brentford team, it could be useful to actually look at the next goalkeeper for Brentford, seeing if it's actually reproducible, the sort of style of play that they have where they actually concede a lot of shots, but not necessarily the most sort of damaging shots. And we'll see what happens next year when we look at Brentford. Potentially their keeper option is something that we'll be looking at once again. But that's going to be it for my season review so far. It's nice to see, of course, who hurt me the most, who did the best for me in the season. But sometimes I think also there is a small shade of luck in that, and you actually also have to factor in how easy was it to actually spot some things, like, for example, you know, Andreas and even Harrison Reed, these two players, they kind of got points at the wrong times when they came off your bench, or got points at the right times when they actually came off your bench. And sometimes that's just pure luck, because you can't really expect when you get a bit of bench jam and whatnot. But that's it for my season. And ultimately, thank you guys so much for watching the content this year. I think this was my best FPL season so far, and I'm hopeful and looking to actually improve on that rank next year as well. And I do think I've improved quite a bit as a manager, but the sort of game week to game week decision making is something that I'm constantly focused on improving on, and we'll see what happens next year as well. But thank you guys so much for watching, as I said, and I'll see you guys in the next video.